In the annals of American history, few figures loom as large as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His story is not merely one of political achievement, but a profound testament to the indomitable human spirit, the power of optimism in the face of despair, and the capacity of one individual to fundamentally reshape a nation's destiny. Born into privilege yet forged by adversity, Roosevelt would become the only president elected to 4 terms, guiding America through its 2 greatest crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. But the true measure of Franklin Roosevelt lies not simply in the offices he held or the policies he enacted. It resides in something far more elemental: his unwavering belief that government could be a force for good, his infectious optimism that tomorrow could be better than today, and his remarkable ability to connect with ordinary Americans in a way that made them believe in themselves again. This is the story of a man who refused to be defined by his limitations, who transformed personal struggle into public service, and who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30, 1882, at Springwood, his family's estate in Hyde Park, New York. He entered a world of considerable privilege. The Roosevelts were among America's old money aristocracy, descended from Dutch settlers who arrived in New Amsterdam in the 1640s. His father, James Roosevelt, was a wealthy businessman and landowner. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, came from an equally prominent family with deep roots in American commerce and society. Young Franklin grew up in an environment of cultured refinement. The Roosevelt estate overlooked the Hudson River, a sprawling property where the boy learned to ride horses, sailboats, and appreciate the natural world. He was an only child, doted upon by his mother, who would remain a powerful influence throughout his life. James Roosevelt, though considerably older than his wife, instilled in his son a sense of noblesse oblige, the idea that privilege carried with it responsibility to serve others. The Roosevelt household was cosmopolitan and intellectually stimulating. The family traveled extensively to Europe, and young Franklin became fluent in German and French. He collected stamps with a passion that would last his entire life, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of geography and world affairs. These travels and the conversations around the Roosevelt dinner table exposed him to a wider world and planted seeds of international awareness that would prove invaluable in his later leadership. Education came through private tutors until age 14, when Franklin was sent to Groton School, an elite preparatory institution in Massachusetts. Groton's headmaster, Endicott Peabody, was a formidable figure who preached a doctrine of Christian service and social responsibility. Peabody believed that boys of privilege should dedicate themselves to public service and the betterment of society. This philosophy resonated deeply with young Roosevelt, providing an ethical framework that would guide his political philosophy. At Groton, Franklin was not the most popular or athletic student, but he was earnest and well-liked. He sang in the choir, managed the baseball team when he couldn't make the roster, and absorbed Peabody's teachings about duty and service. The headmaster's influence was so profound that Roosevelt would later say, "As long as I live, his influence will mean more to me than that of any other people next to my father and mother." In 1900, Franklin entered Harvard University, where he would spend 4 years that proved formative in unexpected ways. Academically, he was a competent but not outstanding student, earning mostly C's in his coursework. But Roosevelt was never one to let grades define him. He threw himself into extracurricular activities, joining numerous clubs and eventually becoming editor of the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper. This position gave him his first real taste of influence and public voice. During his Harvard years, tragedy struck when his father died in December 1900. The loss was profound, but Franklin responded by redoubling his commitment to making something of himself. He began to emerge from the shadow of his mother's protective care, developing his own identity and ambitions. Through the Crimson, he editorialized on campus issues and began to develop his skills as a communicator, talents that would become his greatest political asset. It was also at Harvard that Franklin met Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin once removed. Eleanor was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, who was then making his own remarkable ascent in politics, becoming vice president and then, after William McKinley's assassination, President of the United States. Eleanor had endured a difficult childhood. Her mother had been cold and critical, her father an alcoholic who died when she was young. She had been raised largely by her grandmother and emerged as a serious, socially conscious young woman involved in settlement housework in New York's immigrant neighborhoods. Franklin was immediately drawn to Eleanor's depth and social commitment. Their courtship revealed a side of Roosevelt that would prove central to his character: his ability to recognize and value qualities in others that complemented his own. Where Franklin was outgoing and socially confident, Eleanor was thoughtful and deeply empathetic. Where he had experienced privilege without question, she had witnessed poverty and injustice firsthand. Their relationship would become one of the most complex and ultimately productive partnerships in American political history. Franklin and Eleanor were married on March 17, 1905, with President Theodore Roosevelt giving away the bride. The wedding was a grand social affair, but it also represented the union of two branches of the Roosevelt family and two distinct approaches to public life. Theodore Roosevelt had burst onto the national stage as a reformer and trustbuster, bringing energy and moral conviction to the presidency. His example would prove inspirational to young Franklin, who admired his distant cousin's vigor and progressive politics. After their marriage, Franklin entered Columbia Law School, though he was never particularly passionate about the law itself. He passed the bar exam and took a position at a prestigious Wall Street law firm, but his heart wasn't in corporate practice. He found the work tedious and began to look for other outlets for his ambitions. Politics beckoned, and in 1910, opportunity knocked. The Democratic Party in New York's Dutchess County approached Roosevelt about running for the state Senate. It seemed like a long shot. The district was heavily Republican, and Democrats rarely won there. But Franklin saw possibility where others saw futility. He threw himself into the campaign with characteristic energy, renting a red Maxwell touring car and driving throughout the district, speaking to farmers, workers, and small-town residents. His approach was novel for the time. Rather than relying solely on party bosses and traditional power brokers, he took his message directly to the people. Roosevelt's platform emphasized progressive reform, clean government, and standing up to Tammany Hall, the notoriously corrupt Democratic political machine that controlled New York City politics. He spoke eloquently about the need for politicians to serve the public interest rather than special interests. His youth, his famous name, his obvious sincerity, and his tireless campaigning style combined to create an upset victory. At age 28, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to the New York State Senate. In Albany, State Senator Roosevelt immediately made a name for himself by challenging his own party's establishment. When Tammany Hall tried to install their chosen candidate for U.S. Senator, Roosevelt organized a group of insurgent Democrats to block the nomination. He and his allies held out for weeks, drawing statewide and even national attention. Though they ultimately had to compromise, Roosevelt had established himself as a reformer willing to fight the political machines, a reputation that served him well. During his time in the state Senate, Roosevelt championed progressive causes, conservation of natural resources, labor rights, and government reform. He learned the art of legislative maneuvering, building coalitions, and maintaining public support through effective communication with the press. He also learned important lessons about when to fight and when to compromise, when to lead from the front and when to work behind the scenes. Eleanor, meanwhile, was beginning her own journey of public engagement. As Franklin's political career took off, she managed their growing household. They would eventually have 6 children, though one died in infancy. But Eleanor was never content to be merely a political wife. She involved herself in social reform work, visiting tenements and factories, educating herself about the conditions facing working people and immigrants. Her work gave Franklin insights into social problems he might not have encountered in his privileged world, and she became his eyes and ears among constituencies he needed to understand. In 1912, Roosevelt supported Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign, working energetically for the Democratic ticket in New York. When Wilson won, he rewarded Roosevelt's loyalty by appointing him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position Theodore Roosevelt had held years earlier. At age 31, Franklin moved to Washington, where he would spend the next 7 years in a role that perfectly suited his interests and abilities. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt came into his own as an administrator and leader. He threw himself into the work with unbounded enthusiasm, overseeing the Navy's business operations, shipyards, and civilian personnel. He traveled constantly, inspecting naval facilities, building relationships with officers and workers, and absorbing everything he could about naval operations and strategy. Roosevelt proved to be an extraordinarily effective administrator. He modernized procurement procedures, improved labor relations at naval yards, and pushed for expansion of the fleet. He understood that the Navy was not just a military force but a complex organization requiring efficient management, technological innovation, and human resource development. His time at the Navy Department gave him invaluable experience in running a large government bureaucracy, experience that would prove crucial in his later presidency. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Roosevelt immediately grasped the conflict's significance and advocated for American military preparedness. While President Wilson maintained neutrality, Roosevelt quietly worked to strengthen the Navy. He developed strong relationships with naval officers and became an advocate for the sea service in Washington's bureaucratic battles. He loved the Navy and its traditions, and the Navy loved him in return. After America entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt's responsibilities expanded dramatically. He coordinated with the British Navy, oversaw the massive expansion of American naval forces, and pushed innovative solutions to the German U-boat threat. One of his most significant contributions was advocating for the North Sea Mine Barrage, a controversial plan to plant a massive minefield across the North Sea to bottle up German submarines. Many naval officers considered it impractical, but Roosevelt championed the project, and it was eventually implemented, contributing to the Allied victory. In 1918, Roosevelt made an inspection tour of the European battlefront, witnessing the horrors of modern warfare firsthand. He visited naval installations, met with Allied leaders, and came under enemy fire. The experience deepened his understanding of international affairs and convinced him of the need for international cooperation to prevent future wars. He returned home a confirmed supporter of President Wilson's vision for a League of Nations. The Navy years also brought personal challenges. Franklin's marriage to Eleanor came under severe strain when she discovered his romantic relationship with Lucy Mercer, her social secretary. The betrayal devastated Eleanor, and she considered divorce. Only the intervention of Franklin's mother Sarah, who threatened to cut him off financially, and his political advisor Lewis Howe, who warned of the career implications, kept the marriage intact. Franklin agreed never to see Lucy again, and Eleanor agreed to stay, but their relationship fundamentally changed. It evolved from a romantic partnership into something more complex, a political alliance and deep friendship based on shared values and mutual respect, if no longer on romantic love. This marital crisis, painful as it was, may have contributed to both Franklin's and Eleanor's development as public figures. Eleanor, hurt and disillusioned, threw herself more fully into her own work and interests, developing an independent identity and political voice that would make her one of the most influential first ladies in history. Franklin, chastened, recommitted himself to his family and career, and perhaps gained a deeper understanding of human frailty and the importance of redemption, qualities that would make him a more empathetic leader. When the war ended in 1918, Roosevelt had established himself as one of the rising stars of the Democratic Party. He had proven his administrative abilities, his capacity for hard work, and his talent for building relationships across party lines. He had a famous name, a distinguished war record, and obvious political gifts. In 1920, when the Democratic Party needed to build a ticket to challenge the Republicans, they turned to Franklin Roosevelt to run for vice president alongside presidential nominee James Cox. The 1920 campaign was Roosevelt's introduction to national politics, and it proved to be a baptism by fire. The campaign took him across the country, where he spoke to thousands of Americans and honed his skills as a public speaker. He championed Wilson's League of Nations and the Democratic record on progressive reform. His energy was inexhaustible, his optimism infectious, and his speaking style compelling. Though Cox and Roosevelt lost badly in the Republican landslide that year, the country was tired of Wilson and wary of international entanglements. Franklin had made his mark on the national stage. In the summer of 1921, Franklin Roosevelt's life changed forever. While vacationing at the family's summer home on Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada, he fell ill. What began as fatigue and a fever rapidly progressed into something far more serious. Within days, Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down. The diagnosis was poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis, as it was then called. For a man of boundless physical energy who loved to sail, swim, hike, and ride horses, the diagnosis was devastating. At 39 years old, with a bright political future seemingly ahead of him, Roosevelt faced the possibility that his active life was over. Many people, including some of his political associates, assumed his career was finished. Even Eleanor and Lewis Howe, his closest advisors, had doubts about whether he could continue in politics. But they had underestimated Franklin Roosevelt's determination and his capacity to transform adversity into strength. The man who emerged from the ordeal of polio was in many ways the same optimistic, energetic Franklin who had contracted it, but with added dimensions of courage, empathy, and perseverance that would define his greatest achievements. The physical rehabilitation was grueling. Roosevelt tried every treatment available, exercises, massages, experimental therapies. He refused to accept that he would never walk again. In 1924, he discovered Warm Springs, Georgia, where the warm mineral waters seemed to help his paralyzed muscles. He began spending extended periods there, swimming and exercising in the therapeutic pools. He bought the property and developed it into a rehabilitation center for other polio patients, demonstrating the compassion and social consciousness that would characterize his presidency. At Warm Springs, Roosevelt connected with other polio patients from all walks of life. For the first time, the privileged Roosevelt experienced what it meant to struggle with a disability, to face discrimination and low expectations, to require assistance with basic tasks. These experiences gave him a profound empathy for people facing hardship through no fault of their own, an empathy that would inform his approach to the Great Depression. But the physical challenges, immense as they were, paled beside the psychological battle. Roosevelt had to confront his own limitations, his vulnerability, his dependence on others. He had to find a way to reconcile his self-image as a vigorous, active leader with the reality of his disability. His solution was characteristically bold. He would convince himself and others that he was recovering, that his paralysis was temporary, that he would walk again. This may have been a form of denial, but it was also a brilliant psychological strategy. By maintaining an attitude of optimistic determination, Roosevelt kept hope alive, for himself and for those around him. More importantly, he developed techniques to minimize the appearance of his disability in public. He taught himself to walk by locking his leg braces and pivoting on a cane while holding someone's arm. He ensured he was always seated when people entered a room. He developed an informal understanding with the press that they would not photograph him in his wheelchair or being carried. These efforts to conceal his disability have been criticized by some as dishonest or as reflecting shame about his condition. But they can also be understood as Roosevelt's recognition of political reality. In the 1920s and 1930s, a wheelchair-bound politician would have faced insurmountable prejudice. His strategies allowed him to continue his career and ultimately to lead the nation through its gravest crises. In doing so, he also demonstrated something profound about disability, that it need not define a person's capabilities or limit their contributions. Eleanor and Lewis Howe played crucial roles during this period. Eleanor, despite the strains in her marriage, became Franklin's political proxy, attending meetings, giving speeches, and keeping the Roosevelt name active in Democratic politics. She overcame her natural shyness and became a skilled public speaker in her own right. Lewis Howe, Roosevelt's chief political advisor, never wavered in his conviction that Franklin would be president someday. He managed Roosevelt's political correspondence, maintained his connections, and planned his comeback. In 1924, Roosevelt made a dramatic return to national politics when he delivered the nominating speech for Al Smith at the Democratic National Convention. Appearing on stage with his braces and canes, he delivered a powerful address that moved the audience and announced his return to public life. He called Smith the Happy Warrior, a phrase that would come to describe Roosevelt himself. Though Smith didn't win the nomination that year, Roosevelt had proven that his political career was far from over. 4 years later, in 1928, when Al Smith finally secured the Democratic presidential nomination, he urged Roosevelt to run for governor of New York. Roosevelt was reluctant. He wanted more time to focus on his recovery, but Smith convinced him that his candidacy was essential to help carry New York for the Democratic ticket. In one of the closest races in New York history, Roosevelt won the governorship by a narrow margin, even as Smith lost the presidential race in a landslide. As governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt demonstrated the leadership qualities and progressive instincts that would define his presidency. He took office just as the stock market crashed in October 1929, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. While President Herbert Hoover downplayed the crisis and resisted federal intervention, Governor Roosevelt immediately recognized the severity of the situation and the need for government action. Roosevelt established the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, making New York the first state to provide unemployment relief. He championed labor legislation, public works projects, and regulations on utilities. He worked to develop electric power projects that would bring affordable electricity to rural areas. He reformed the state's prisons and hospitals, showing particular concern for the most vulnerable citizens. His approach to governance was pragmatic and experimental. "The country needs bold, persistent experimentation," he declared. "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." This philosophy of active government and willingness to experiment would become the hallmark of his New Deal programs as president. Roosevelt also proved to be a masterful communicator. He used radio to speak directly to New Yorkers, explaining his policies in clear, conversational language. These radio addresses were precursors to his famous fireside chats as president. He understood intuitively that, in the modern age, political leaders needed to communicate directly with citizens, not just through newspapers and party organizations. His success as governor made Roosevelt the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. The Depression had deepened into catastrophe. A quarter of the workforce was unemployed, banks were failing, farms were being foreclosed, and bread lines stretched around city blocks. President Hoover seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to take the bold action the crisis demanded. The country was desperate for change, and Roosevelt offered hope. At the 1932 Democratic Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt broke with tradition by flying to Chicago to accept the nomination in person rather than waiting the customary weeks. His acceptance speech outlined his vision for a New Deal for the American people. The phrase, suggested by one of his advisors, captured the public imagination and gave a name to the policies Roosevelt would implement as president. The 1932 campaign showcased Roosevelt's political talents. Despite his disability, he conducted a vigorous campaign, traveling thousands of miles by train and automobile. He radiated confidence and optimism at a time when both were in desperately short supply. His message was clear: the government had a responsibility to help citizens in distress, the economy needed bold reform, and America's best days lay ahead, not behind. On Election Day, Roosevelt won in a landslide, carrying 42 of 48 states. The victory gave him a strong mandate for change. But between the election in November and his inauguration the following March, the Depression reached its nadir. Banks failed in record numbers, unemployment continued to rise, and the country seemed on the brink of collapse. The long wait until inauguration, March 4th in those days, seemed interminable. When Roosevelt finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1933, the nation was desperate for leadership. What they heard in his inaugural address was a message of hope and determination that has echoed through history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Franklin Roosevelt's first 100 days in office represented one of the most concentrated periods of legislative activity in American history. He immediately declared a bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks to stop the panic-driven withdrawals that were causing bank failures. He pushed through Congress the Emergency Banking Act, which allowed sound banks to reopen with federal support. When the banks reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals. Roosevelt had restored confidence in the banking system through decisive action. But this was just the beginning. Working with a Congress eager for leadership, Roosevelt launched a comprehensive program to provide relief for the unemployed, recovery for the economy, and reform to prevent future depressions. The programs and agencies that emerged from this period, known collectively as the New Deal, would fundamentally transform the relationship between the American government and its citizens. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work on conservation projects, planting trees, building parks, and preventing soil erosion. The program not only provided employment and restored hope to jobless young people, but also accomplished tremendous conservation work that benefited the nation for generations. The Public Works Administration funded major construction projects, roads, bridges, dams, public buildings, that employed millions and built infrastructure the country desperately needed. The Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to help farmers devastated by low crop prices and drought. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and economic development to one of the nation's poorest regions through a comprehensive program of dam construction and regional planning. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempted to stabilize prices and promote fair competition, while its Section 7A guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. Perhaps most enduringly, the Social Security Act of 1935 created a social safety net for elderly Americans, providing retirement pensions funded through payroll taxes. For the first time, the federal government accepted responsibility for ensuring basic economic security for its elderly citizens. The act also provided unemployment insurance and aid to dependent children and the disabled. Though limited in scope compared to social welfare programs in other industrialized nations, Social Security represented a revolutionary change in American social policy. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to regulate stock markets and prevent the kind of speculation and fraud that had contributed to the 1929 crash. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured bank deposits, eliminating the risk of losing one's savings in a bank failure. These reforms restored confidence in financial institutions and helped prevent future crashes. Roosevelt's approach to the Depression was pragmatic rather than ideological. He was willing to try different approaches, to experiment, to admit when something didn't work and try something else. Some New Deal programs succeeded brilliantly. Others failed or had unintended consequences. The National Recovery Administration, for instance, was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court and is generally considered one of the New Deal's failures. But the willingness to act, to experiment, to use government power to address economic catastrophe, this represented a fundamental shift in American governance. Critics attacked the New Deal from both left and right. Conservatives accused Roosevelt of socialism, of destroying free enterprise, of accumulating dictatorial powers. Progressives argued he didn't go far enough, that more radical redistribution of wealth was needed. Roosevelt navigated between these extremes, understanding that his reforms needed to preserve capitalism while making it more humane and sustainable. "I am that kind of conservative because I am that kind of liberal," he once explained, capturing the paradox at the heart of his political philosophy. Roosevelt also revolutionized political communication. His fireside chats, radio addresses delivered in a warm, conversational tone, made Americans feel that the president was speaking directly to them in their living rooms. He explained complex policies in simple language, admitted difficulties, and maintained an infectious optimism that helped sustain public morale. His mastery of radio made him one of the most personally popular presidents in history. Eleanor Roosevelt, meanwhile, became an unprecedented active First Lady. She traveled constantly, visiting coal mines, slums, and farms, serving as Franklin's eyes and ears among populations he couldn't easily reach. She held her own press conferences, wrote a daily newspaper column, and advocated forcefully for civil rights, women's rights, and economic justice. While Franklin had to be cautious about getting too far ahead of public opinion, Eleanor could advocate for more progressive positions, pushing the administration leftward and keeping issues of justice and equality in the public eye. The partnership between Franklin and Eleanor, though no longer romantic, became one of the most productive in political history. They disagreed on many issues, and Eleanor frequently criticized administration policies she considered too cautious. But Franklin valued her perspectives and moral compass, even when he didn't follow her advice. She kept him connected to the conscience of the progressive movement and reminded him of the human dimensions of policy decisions. Roosevelt's popularity and the success of New Deal programs led to a crushing re-election victory in 1936. He carried every state except Maine and Vermont, winning the largest electoral college majority in a century. The victory seemed to give him an invincible mandate, but his second term would prove far more challenging than his first. Frustrated by a conservative Supreme Court that had struck down several New Deal programs, Roosevelt proposed expanding the court from 9 to 15 justices, allowing him to appoint new justices who would support his programs. The court-packing plan, as critics called it, was deeply unpopular even among Roosevelt's supporters. It seemed to violate constitutional tradition and smacked of the kind of authoritarian behavior critics had long accused him of harboring. Congress rejected the plan, handing Roosevelt one of his most significant political defeats. Yet Roosevelt may have lost the battle while winning the war. The court, perhaps responding to the political pressure, began upholding New Deal legislation. One justice switched his vote in key cases, a change referred to as the switch in time that saved 9. Roosevelt was able to appoint several new justices as older ones retired, reshaping the court for decades. But the court-packing controversy damaged Roosevelt's reputation and emboldened his critics. Economic challenges also mounted during the second term. In 1937, believing the worst of the Depression was over, Roosevelt reduced government spending on New Deal programs. The result was a sharp recession that wiped out many of the gains of previous years. Critics dubbed it the Roosevelt recession, and it seemed to confirm arguments that New Deal policies were hindering rather than helping recovery. Roosevelt responded by resuming heavy government spending, and the economy began to recover again. But increasingly, Roosevelt's attention was turning to foreign affairs. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany and was rapidly rearming and expanding German territory. In Asia, Imperial Japan was waging aggressive war in China. Italy under Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia. The fragile peace established after World War I was crumbling, and Roosevelt could see another global conflict approaching. Most Americans, scarred by the experience of World War I, were determined to stay out of any foreign wars. Congress had passed strict neutrality laws prohibiting arms sales to nations at war. But Roosevelt believed that America's security was tied to the survival of Britain and France, and that Nazi Germany posed a threat to democracy everywhere. He began looking for ways to help the democracies while maintaining official neutrality. When World War II erupted in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, Roosevelt called Congress into special session to revise the neutrality laws. He managed to win a cash-and-carry provision allowing Britain and France to buy American arms if they paid cash and transported them in their own ships. It was a small step, but it signaled American support for the democracies. As the war intensified, with France falling to Germany in the spring of 1940 and Britain standing alone against the Nazi onslaught, Roosevelt became increasingly convinced that America would eventually have to enter the war. But he moved carefully, knowing that public opinion was still strongly isolationist. He provided Britain with American destroyers in exchange for military bases, describing it as strengthening America's own defense. He proposed the Lend-Lease program, which would allow America to supply Britain with weapons and supplies without requiring immediate payment. He memorably described America as the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt's decision to run for a third term in 1940 broke with the two-term tradition established by George Washington. No president had ever sought a third term, and many felt Roosevelt was setting a dangerous precedent. But Roosevelt believed the international crisis required experienced leadership, and he convinced the Democratic Party to nominate him again. He won a comfortable victory, though his margin was smaller than in 1932 or 1936. The third term saw Roosevelt's careful preparation of America for war while maintaining the fiction of neutrality. After his re-election, he pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, which passed Congress in March 1941. America began producing massive quantities of weapons, planes, tanks, and ships, ostensibly for Britain, but also building up American military capacity. Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill aboard a warship off Newfoundland in August 1941, where they crafted the Atlantic Charter outlining their vision for the post-war world. Though America was not yet at war, Roosevelt was planning for eventual American involvement and for the peace that would follow. The relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill would become one of the most important partnerships of the 20th century. The two men were very different. Churchill was combative, melodramatic, and prone to depression, while Roosevelt was optimistic, pragmatic, and emotionally resilient. But they shared a commitment to defeating fascism and a vision of liberal democracy as the foundation of the post-war order. They developed a warm friendship, corresponding regularly and meeting numerous times during the war. Their partnership was essential to Allied victory. The debate over American involvement ended abruptly on December 7, 1941, when Japanese forces attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. America was now fully engaged in a global war on two fronts. Roosevelt's leadership during World War II represented the culmination of his political career. The skills he had developed over decades, his ability to inspire and communicate, his gift for strategy and coalition building, his talent for choosing capable subordinates and empowering them to act, his unshakable optimism, all came together in service of the greatest challenge America had ever faced. The war required mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Millions of men were drafted and trained. American industry was converted entirely to war production, turning out ships, planes, tanks, and ammunition in quantities that staggered the imagination. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, taking on jobs traditionally held by men. The entire economy was directed toward a single purpose: winning the war. Roosevelt worked tirelessly to maintain the alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, three nations with very different political systems and post-war goals. He had to balance Stalin's demands for a second front in Europe with the practical realities of military preparation. He had to mediate between Churchill's desire to protect the British Empire and American anti-colonial principles. He had to maintain American public support for the war while managing setbacks and the terrible cost in lives. The president met repeatedly with Churchill and Stalin at conferences in Tehran, Cairo, and Yalta, planning strategy and beginning to shape the post-war world. At these meetings, Roosevelt demonstrated diplomatic skills of the highest order. He charmed Stalin, worked through disagreements with Churchill, and advanced American interests while maintaining the alliance. He believed that personal relationships among leaders mattered, that he could build enough trust with Stalin to ensure post-war cooperation. Roosevelt also made difficult and controversial decisions. The decision to intern Japanese Americans in camps after Pearl Harbor is now recognized as one of the great injustices of the Roosevelt presidency, a decision driven by fear and prejudice that violated basic civil liberties. Roosevelt's failure to do more to help European Jews fleeing Nazi persecution is another moral stain on his record. While he allowed more Jewish refugees into America than most other nations, he could have done far more, and his administration's restrictions on immigration contributed to the deaths of Jews who might have been saved. Yet Roosevelt's overall leadership during the war was masterful. He appointed talented military leaders, George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Chester Nimitz, Douglas MacArthur, and gave them the resources and authority they needed to fight. He supported the development of new technologies, including the atomic bomb, understanding that victory would go to the side that could innovate faster. He maintained public morale through his fireside chats, helping Americans understand what they were fighting for and why the sacrifices were necessary. As the tide of war turned in the Allies' favor, Roosevelt's thoughts turned increasingly to the post-war world. He was determined that this time, unlike after World War I, America would not retreat into isolationism. He championed the creation of the United Nations, an international organization that would prevent future wars through collective security. He envisioned a world where the four policemen, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, would maintain peace and promote democracy and economic development. In 1944, despite visibly declining health, Roosevelt ran for a fourth term. The war was not yet won, and he believed the continuity of his leadership was essential. He won again, though by a smaller margin than before. He was obviously exhausted and unwell, but he pushed forward, driven by determination to see the war through to victory and to establish the United Nations. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 would be Roosevelt's last great diplomatic effort. Meeting with Churchill and Stalin in the Soviet Crimea, he negotiated agreements on the post-war occupation of Germany, Soviet entry into the war against Japan, and the structure of the United Nations. The Yalta agreements have been controversial ever since. Critics charge that Roosevelt gave away too much to Stalin, allowing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Defenders argue that Roosevelt did the best he could given the military realities, and that without Soviet cooperation, the war in Asia would have been far more costly. The truth is probably that Roosevelt, exhausted and ill, was not at his best at Yalta, and that he underestimated Stalin's intentions for Eastern Europe. He believed he could work with Stalin to create a stable post-war order. He was wrong about that, and the Cold War that followed demonstrated the limits of his post-war vision. But he cannot be blamed for not foreseeing how completely the world would change, or for trying to build a lasting peace through cooperation rather than confrontation. By early 1945, Franklin Roosevelt was clearly failing. Friends and associates were shocked by his appearance. He had lost weight, his hands trembled, his face was gaunt. The years of stress, the disability, the unrelenting pace of work had taken their toll. But he pressed on, still believing he had essential work to complete. In March 1945, he addressed Congress on the Yalta Conference, appearing in the House chamber in his wheelchair, something he had never done before. He acknowledged his disability publicly for the first time, asking to be allowed to remain seated during his speech. "I hope you will pardon me for this unusual posture of sitting down," he said, "but I know you will realize it makes it a lot easier for me not to have to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had spent decades concealing his disability. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt was at his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, the place that had given him so much comfort over the years. He was sitting for a portrait, working on correspondence, when he suddenly complained of a terrible headache. "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," he said. Those were his last words. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Within hours, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead at age 63. The news stunned the nation and the world. For millions of Americans, Roosevelt was the only president they had ever known. He had held office for 12 years and was in his 13th. His voice on the radio had been a constant presence, a source of reassurance and leadership through the nation's darkest hours. People wept openly in the streets. Around the world, leaders and ordinary citizens mourned the loss of a man who had championed freedom and democracy against the forces of tyranny. Roosevelt did not live to see the final victory in World War II. Germany surrendered less than a month after his death, and Japan surrendered in August 1945. He did not live to see the United Nations hold its first meetings, though the organization he championed would become a lasting, if imperfect, force for international cooperation. He did not live to see how the post-war world would develop, how the alliance with the Soviet Union would collapse into Cold War, how the problems of race and inequality he had begun to address would explode into a civil rights revolution. But his legacy was secure. Franklin Roosevelt had transformed the American presidency, making it the center of American government in a way it had never been before. He had established the principle that the federal government had a responsibility to ensure the economic security and welfare of its citizens. He had led America through its greatest economic crisis and its greatest military challenge. He had helped save democracy when it was threatened by fascism and economic collapse. The true measure of Franklin Roosevelt's impact on America and the world can be seen in the endurance of the institutions and principles he established. The New Deal programs he created, Social Security, unemployment insurance, federal regulation of banking and securities, support for labor unions, public works and infrastructure investment, became permanent features of American life. Though conservatives have challenged and modified these programs, none has been eliminated. The social safety net Roosevelt created, however frayed it might sometimes become, remains a fundamental expectation of American government. Roosevelt's expansion of presidential power fundamentally altered the American political system. Before Roosevelt, the president was generally seen as the executor of laws passed by Congress. After Roosevelt, the president became the chief legislator, the agenda setter, the voice of the nation. This transformation has had both positive and negative consequences. It has enabled decisive leadership in times of crisis, but it has also led to concerns about executive overreach and the imperial presidency. Yet there is no question that Roosevelt's model of presidential leadership became the template for all who followed him. His communication skills revolutionized political leadership. Roosevelt understood that in the age of mass media, political leaders needed to speak directly to citizens, to explain policies in clear language, to inspire and reassure. Every president since Roosevelt has been judged in part on their communication abilities, their capacity to use media effectively, their skill at connecting with ordinary Americans. The fireside chat model, the leader speaking intimately and directly to citizens, has been adapted to every new medium from television to the internet. Roosevelt's impact on the Democratic Party was equally profound. He forged a coalition that would dominate American politics for decades, bringing together working-class voters, farmers, ethnic minorities, labor unions, urban political machines, and liberal intellectuals. This New Deal coalition transformed the Democrats from a regional party focused on the South and rural interests into a national party championing active government and economic security. Though this coalition has fragmented in recent decades, its influence on Democratic Party politics remains strong. Perhaps most significantly, Roosevelt established the principle that government should be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. This was a revolutionary idea in American politics, where government had traditionally been seen as a night watchman, protecting property and maintaining order but otherwise staying out of citizens' lives. Roosevelt argued that in a modern industrial democracy, government had positive obligations to ensure economic security, to protect workers' rights, to prevent gross inequality, to provide opportunities for all citizens. His critics, both during his lifetime and since, have argued that Roosevelt's expansion of government threatened individual liberty and free enterprise. They contend that the New Deal created a culture of dependency, stifled economic growth through regulation and taxation, and concentrated dangerous power in the federal government. These debates continue today, and they reflect fundamental disagreements about the proper role of government in society. But what cannot be disputed is that Roosevelt's policies helped millions of Americans survive the Great Depression, that his leadership was essential to Allied victory in World War II, and that the institutions he created have endured because they met real human needs. Social Security has lifted millions of elderly Americans out of poverty. Bank deposit insurance has prevented the kind of panics that devastated the economy in the 1930s. Public works projects built infrastructure that served the nation for generations. Labor protections gave workers greater dignity and security. Understanding Franklin Roosevelt's achievements requires understanding the personal qualities that made him such an effective leader. His optimism was not naive cheerfulness but a calculated strategy and a deeply held conviction. He genuinely believed that problems could be solved, that tomorrow would be better than today, that America's best days lay ahead. This optimism was infectious. It gave hope to millions during the Depression and inspired confidence during the war. His courage, both physical and political, was extraordinary. The courage to continue his career after polio, to appear in public despite his disability, to maintain an image of vigor and health, this required enormous determination. The political courage to experiment with new policies, to challenge powerful interests, to take on the Supreme Court, to lead a reluctant nation toward war, these decisions required moral courage and a willingness to accept criticism and risk failure. Roosevelt's pragmatism was another key strength. He was not bound by ideology or consistency. He was willing to try different approaches, to learn from failure, to adopt his opponent's ideas if they worked. "I have no expectation of making a hit every time I come to bat," he said. "What I seek is the highest possible batting average." This pragmatic experimentalism frustrated his critics but allowed him to respond flexibly to rapidly changing circumstances. His political skills were highly refined. He was a master at building coalitions, at finding compromises that allowed diverse groups to work together. He understood power, how to accumulate it, how to use it, how to maintain it. He could be ruthless in pursuing his goals, but he maintained a genial public persona that made people want to work with him. He had an exceptional ability to read people, to understand their motivations, to appeal to their better instincts while also recognizing their limitations. Roosevelt's empathy, deepened by his personal struggles with polio, made him sensitive to the suffering of others. He could connect emotionally with people's problems in a way that few politicians could match. When he spoke about hunger, unemployment, fear, his listeners knew he understood what they were experiencing. This empathy informed his policies and gave moral urgency to his political programs. His intellectual curiosity and love of learning served him well. Though not a systematic thinker or a deep philosopher, Roosevelt read widely, consulted experts, and absorbed information voraciously. He surrounded himself with talented advisors, the brain trust of academics and policy experts who helped design the New Deal, and he was skilled at synthesizing their ideas into practical policies. Perhaps most importantly, Roosevelt possessed an unshakable self-confidence. Despite his disability, despite political setbacks, despite the enormous challenges he faced, he never doubted his ability to lead. This confidence inspired others and allowed him to take bold actions that more timid leaders would have avoided. Yet his confidence was tempered by enough self-awareness to recognize when he needed advice and enough humor to laugh at himself. No account of Franklin Roosevelt's life and achievements would be complete without acknowledging Eleanor's central role. Their partnership, though it evolved from romantic love into something more complex, became one of the most productive collaborations in political history. Eleanor was far more than a supportive spouse. She was a political force in her own right, an advocate for justice and equality, a conscience that pushed Franklin toward his better instincts. Eleanor's work during Franklin's presidency was groundbreaking. She redefined the role of First Lady, transforming it from a largely ceremonial position into a platform for advocacy and social change. She traveled constantly, visiting areas her husband couldn't easily reach due to his disability. She went into coal mines to see working conditions firsthand, visited slums and migrant camps, met with civil rights leaders and labor organizers. She became Franklin's connection to constituencies and perspectives he might otherwise have missed. She held her own press conferences, for female reporters only, ensuring they would be hired by news organizations that wanted White House access. She wrote a daily newspaper column, My Day, that reached millions of readers. She advocated forcefully for civil rights at a time when Franklin had to be cautious about alienating Southern Democrats in Congress. Her resignation from the Daughters of the American Revolution after they refused to allow African-American singer Marian Anderson to perform at Constitution Hall sent a powerful message about racial justice. Franklin didn't always follow Eleanor's advice, and their disagreements were real and sometimes sharp. She pushed him to do more for civil rights, to be bolder in addressing poverty and inequality, to take stronger stands on social justice issues. He often resisted, believing he had to move more cautiously to maintain political support for his larger agenda. But he valued her perspectives, and she influenced his policies more than most people realized. Their partnership demonstrated that even relationships that don't fit conventional patterns can be enormously productive. They had moved beyond romantic love, but they maintained deep respect, shared values, and genuine affection. They complemented each other perfectly. Where Franklin was cautious about getting ahead of public opinion, Eleanor was willing to advocate for positions that weren't yet popular. Where Franklin was the master politician, Eleanor was the moral voice. Together, they accomplished far more than either could have alone. After Franklin's death, Eleanor continued her public work, serving as a delegate to the United Nations and chairing the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She remained active in democratic politics and continued to advocate for the causes she believed in until her death in 1962. In many ways, she ensured that the Roosevelt legacy extended beyond Franklin's specific policies to encompass broader values of human dignity, social justice, and international cooperation. Franklin Roosevelt was a complex figure, and any complete account must acknowledge his flaws and failures alongside his achievements. His decision to intern Japanese Americans during World War II was unjust and racist, driven by wartime hysteria and prejudice rather than military necessity. Though the Supreme Court upheld the internment at the time, it is now recognized as one of the gravest violations of civil liberties in American history. Roosevelt bears responsibility for this decision, and no account of his presidency should minimize it. His response to the Holocaust was inadequate. While America accepted more Jewish refugees than most other nations, the administration maintained restrictive immigration quotas that kept out many Jews who might have been saved. Roosevelt was aware of Nazi atrocities but failed to make saving European Jews a priority. He could have ordered the bombing of concentration camps or railroad lines leading to them, could have relaxed immigration restrictions, could have spoken out more forcefully. His failure to do more remains a moral stain on his record. Roosevelt's relationship with the truth was often flexible. He was willing to mislead the public when he thought it necessary, to make commitments privately that he denied publicly, to say different things to different audiences. His manipulation of public opinion before America entered World War II, though arguably necessary to prepare the nation for war, involved deception about his intentions and America's level of involvement. Some of his political tactics, including his attempt to pack the Supreme Court, showed a willingness to bend democratic norms when they frustrated his goals. His treatment of his political opponents could be harsh. He tried to purge Democrats who opposed the New Deal in the 1938 primaries, intervening in local races to support more liberal candidates. The effort largely failed and damaged his reputation, but it showed a vindictive streak that contradicted his genial public image. He used the FBI to investigate critics and political enemies, setting precedents for executive abuse of power that later presidents would follow. The New Deal itself had significant limitations and failures. Many programs excluded or discriminated against African Americans. Social Security initially didn't cover agricultural or domestic workers, occupations dominated by Black Americans in the South. The National Recovery Administration's codes sometimes depressed wages for Black workers. Public housing projects were often segregated. Roosevelt needed the support of Southern Democrats in Congress and was unwilling to challenge Jim Crow segregation directly. While Eleanor and some New Deal administrators worked to help African Americans, the administration as a whole did not make racial justice a priority. Some New Deal programs had perverse effects. Agricultural policies that paid farmers to reduce production helped large landowners but often displaced tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Some historians argue that certain New Deal policies prolonged the Depression by creating uncertainty about government policy and interfering with market mechanisms. While these arguments are disputed, they reflect real debates about the New Deal's economic impact. Yet these failures and limitations, significant as they are, do not erase Roosevelt's achievements. Historical figures must be judged in the context of their times while also being held to universal standards of justice. Roosevelt was a man of his era, sharing some of its prejudices and blind spots. But he was also a leader who expanded the boundaries of what was politically possible, who used government power to help millions of people. On a spring afternoon in 1945, democracy against when news of Roosevelt's death he was neither saint nor villain, but a complex human being who rose to extraordinary challenges with remarkable skill and courage. Was heard to say, "I felt as if I knew him. I felt as if he knew me, and I felt as if he liked me." This response captures something essential about Roosevelt's appeal and his achievement. Despite his privileged background, despite his position and power, he connected with ordinary people in a way that made them believe he cared about them personally. This connection was not accidental or merely the result of political skill. It grew from Roosevelt's genuine conviction that every American deserved dignity, security, and opportunity. It reflected his belief that government existed to serve people, not abstract principles or powerful interests. It expressed his optimistic faith in democracy and in the American people's capacity to overcome any challenge. Roosevelt's physical courage in overcoming polio became a metaphor for America's struggle to overcome the Depression and fascism. His refusal to be defeated by disability mirrored the nation's refusal to be defeated by economic catastrophe and military threat. His optimism in the face of terrible challenges sustained national morale when despair threatened to overwhelm hope. He taught Americans that they need not be victims of circumstances but could actively shape their destiny. The institutions he created, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the SEC, the FDIC, and many others, continue to shape American life. The precedent he set for active presidential leadership, for direct communication with citizens, for using federal power to address national problems, defined the modern presidency. The international order he helped create, centered on the United Nations and committed to collective security and human rights, however imperfect its realization, represented a genuine advance over the nationalist rivalries that had produced 2 world wars. His impact extended beyond specific policies and institutions to encompass something less tangible but equally important: a transformation in how Americans understood their government and their relationship to it. Before Roosevelt, government was largely absent from most people's daily lives. After Roosevelt, citizens expected government to play an active role in ensuring economic security, regulating business, protecting consumers and workers, providing infrastructure and services, and responding to social problems. This transformation has been contested and modified over the decades, but the fundamental expectation that government has positive responsibilities to its citizens, this remains Roosevelt's most enduring legacy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died more than 3/4 of a century ago, but his influence continues to shape American life and politics. The debates about government's role that he helped define remain central to American political discourse. The institutions he created continue to provide security for millions. The precedents he set for presidential leadership remain the standard against which his successors are judged. But perhaps his most important legacy is not any specific policy or institution, but rather a spirit, an attitude of optimistic determination, a belief that problems can be solved, that democracy can meet any challenge, that tomorrow can be better than today. This Roosevelt spirit sustained America through depression and war. It inspired the accomplishments of the New Deal and the victory of World War II. It continues to inspire those who believe that government can be a force for good, that leadership matters, that courage and determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Roosevelt's life reminds us that history is made by individuals, by their choices, their courage, their vision, and their willingness to act when action is needed. He was born into privilege but used his advantages to serve others. He suffered a devastating disability but refused to be defined by it. He faced the greatest economic crisis and the gravest military threat in American history and led the nation through both. He was far from perfect. He made serious mistakes, showed poor judgment on some issues, shared some of the prejudices of his time. But when the nation needed leadership most desperately, he provided it with skill, courage, and unwavering optimism. When Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, the nation was on the brink of collapse. Banks were failing, unemployment was at staggering levels, fear and despair gripped the country. When he died 12 years later, America was the most powerful nation on earth, poised to win the greatest war in history and to lead the creation of a new international order. That transformation was not his achievement alone. It resulted from the efforts of millions of Americans and the sacrifices of Allied soldiers and citizens around the world. But Roosevelt's leadership was essential to it. His voice on the radio telling Americans that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, his creation of programs that gave people jobs and hope, his skillful diplomacy in building and maintaining the Grand Alliance against fascism, his vision of a post-war world based on international cooperation and human rights, these were the contributions of a leader at the height of his powers, using his gifts in service of his country and humanity. The final measure of Franklin Roosevelt's greatness lies not in any single achievement but in the totality of his impact, on American government and society, on the Allied victory in World War II, on the creation of international institutions, on the millions of individuals whose lives were improved by the policies he championed. He expanded the boundaries of American democracy to include economic security as a fundamental right. He proved that democracy could meet the challenge of totalitarianism. He demonstrated that physical disability need not limit achievement. He showed that optimism and determination could overcome the gravest challenges. Today, when Americans face their own challenges, economic inequality, political polarization, international threats, they can draw inspiration from Roosevelt's example. His life teaches that leadership matters, that courage can overcome fear, that government can be a force for good, that tomorrow can indeed be better than today. These lessons remain as relevant now as they were in the dark days of 1933 or 1941. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not a perfect man or a perfect president. But he was the right leader at the right time, with the right qualities to guide America through its greatest trials. His courage in the face of polio, his optimism during the Depression, his leadership during the war, his vision for the post-war world, these define his legacy and secure his place among the greatest figures in American history. He proved that one person, armed with courage, vision, and determination, can indeed change the world. His story is ultimately one of hope, hope that challenges can be overcome, that disabilities can be surmounted, that economic collapse can be reversed, that fascism can be defeated, that democracy can prevail. In an age that often seems cynical about leadership and skeptical about government, Roosevelt's life reminds us that these things are possible. His greatest gift to America and the world was not any specific policy or program, but rather this legacy of hope, this spirit of optimistic determination that continues to inspire those who believe, as he did, that America's best days lie ahead.